Hello everyone, today we are going to talk about the top 15 UFC fighters of all time. Now, people often say this topic is highly subjective, and even though there will always be some level of subjectivity, as with many other topics, we can conclude quite objectively what it means to be the best fighter because, like every other sport, MMA has its own rules and concepts. We can see that some things matter more than others by looking at how the sport works and other statistics. So, we should first clarify what those criteria are and what criteria do not matter. I will also explain why each criterion is so important, or more precisely, why some criteria are more important than others. Before anything, we first need to define what greatness actually means. Otherwise, we are not debating who's the greatest, we are debating different definitions of greatness. Without further ado, let's get right into the topic. Okay, so let's first look at the criteria that don't matter. First one is what fighters do outside the UFC cage and doesn't include the rules of the sport. That is their personality, their ability to attract popularity, or how good they are at promoting fights and doing press conferences. There is no rule stating that a fighter must possess any of these qualities. Although the UFC is more likely to promote fighters who excel in these areas, and then entertaining fighters generally have a better chance of gaining popularity and receiving promotional opportunities, none of this affects how good they are at the sport itself. The UFC will always favor fighters who can generate more views, but that has nothing to do with determining who is the greatest fighter of all time. Now, one might say, what about McGregor? He influenced the sport more than anyone else. And that's true. However, there is a difference between being the most influential fighter and being the greatest fighter in the organization. Today, Conor doesn't even come close to the GOAT discussion. Someone else might argue that trash talk or a fighter's behavior outside the cage can affect their opponents. And yes, that is valid, but only to a very small degree. Let's look at some examples. Conor has zero title defenses. Chael Sonnen, who was, by the way, a major inspiration for Conor's promotional style, fought for 4 UFC titles and lost all 4. Despite being one of the biggest trash talkers in the sport, he lost multiple times to Silva and Jones. Then there is Colby Covington, who also relied heavily on trash talk but lost to Kamaru Usman and Leon Edwards. We can clearly see that skill outweighs words by a significant margin, as none of these fighters come close to the GOAT conversation. There is, however, one aspect that is different from traditional trash talk, and that is psychological warfare. This can arguably be more effective because it targets on opponent's confidence and insecurities. One of the best examples is John Jones. However, Jones isn't considered one of the greatest by many because of his psychological warfare, but because of other far more important achievements. Furthermore, psychological warfare can also backfire and is very risky. We recently saw this at UFC Freedom 250 with Ilya Topuria and Justin Gaethje. Ilya put pressure on himself by predicting a first-round knockout, which arguably caused him to gas himself out early and become less effective after the second round. We can also conclude that psychological warfare and trash talk are simply one of many tools a fighter can use, just like reach, speed, or cardio. Rather than an achievement in itself, it may contribute to winning, but it is not an achievement that should be rewarded separately in a GOAT ranking. As for how good or bad someone is as a person, that shouldn't be included as a criterion either. It is not part of the rules. You can like or hate a fighter as much as you want, but as long as they respect the rules and meet the criteria, their personality shouldn't affect their ranking. This isn't a sport about being a gangster or a saint, it's about what you accomplish inside the cage. Another thing that doesn't matter is a fighter's build, height, strength, reach, or any other physical attribute. These are simply advantages or disadvantages that may help in a fight. Similar to the psychological warfare, but they do not define a fighter's legacy, results do. The same applies to a fighting style. A flashy or entertaining style shouldn't be rewarded on its own. It may look impressive, but if it doesn't produce results, it means very little. On the other hand, a boring style that consistently leads to victories and dominance is far more valuable because ultimately results are what matter. Another thing that doesn't matter is potential or what if speculation. What happened inside the cage happened. It is a fact. Anything else simply didn't happen. We should judge fighters based on their accomplishments, not on what they might have achieved. When we already have proven fighters with concrete achievements, it makes no sense to rank someone higher based on assumptions. If a fighter retires early without accomplishing enough to compare with the greatest, that shouldn't be viewed as a positive. The only exception would be a fighter who, in a very short period of time, completely dominates elite competition and builds a resume comparable to the greatest. In other words, I came, I did the job, I left. The closest we've seen to that kind of career was Ilya Topturov Papturov. He was on a trajectory where an unusually short career could have still justified GOAT discussions because of how quickly he accumulated elite accomplishments. However, that trajectory never became reality, and trajectories don't count, only accomplishments do. And one more thing is that the number of losses shouldn't matter nearly as much as the context of those losses. Look, we are all human. We all have bad days, make mistakes, or get caught by a knockout or submission that can change the course of the fight in seconds. No one is completely immune to that at the elite level of competition. Whether it's one loss or a few shouldn't matter nearly as much as long as a fighter has never consistently dominated or completely outclassed during their career. Losing a close fight is also perfectly acceptable. It happens when you are competing against the very best in the world. Now, let's move on to the criteria that do matter. Cheating. Sorry, but this is something that should be considered before anything else. Because this is a sport, and every sport has its rules. If we're talking specifically about MMA, you can fulfill every other criteria I'm about to mention. But if you do not follow the rules, the very foundation of the sport, you automatically disqualify yourself from the GOAT discussion. At that point, it is no longer a fair competition. Let's look at John Jones. He's arguably the most dominant fighter of all time. And if we were ranking the best street fighters in the world, there is no doubt he would be at or near the top. However, he repeatedly cheated. I can understand an accidental eye poke or groin kick, they happen. But making them part of your strategy and doing them consistently is dirty fighting and a direct violation of the rules. On top of that, Jones failed 4 drug tests and even hid from USADA on one occasion. One of the substances he tested positive for was turinabol, which promotes muscle growth, improves recovery, and enhances endurance, giving a fighter an unfair advantage. And yes, contamination from medication or supplements can result in a positive test. However, that's typically a one-time accidental incident, and in such cases, the athlete's guilt is much easier to question. And if someone says, but the fighter didn't cheat in all of his fights, what about all of his other ones? First of all, once a fighter repeatedly breaks the rules, it is no longer about trying to determine which specific performances were clean or not. The issue is that the standard required for GOAT evaluation is consistent fairness across a career, and that standard is no longer fully verifiable. Also, if a fighter truly is the greatest, he should be able to prove it while competing under the same rules as everyone else. So, if a fighter needed to use an unfair advantage, why? And if someone says that cheating doesn't erase his talent, that is absolutely correct. Fighters like John Jones and Anderson Silva are among the most talented individuals the sport has ever seen. But talent is a fair advantage within the sport while cheating is not. Here is a simple analogy. Imagine a shooting competition where every competitor is given the same rusty pistol and only 3 bullets, but one competitor has a brand new pistol with a full magazine. That competitor wins by a huge margin. But if he was truly the best, why did he need to cheat? Again, why didn't he prove it by following the same rules as everyone else? Some people argue that everyone was using PEDs. Maybe there were, maybe there weren't. But GOAT rankings should be based on proven facts, not assumptions. We know Jones and Silva broke the rules. We don't know what everyone else did. For these reasons, fighters such as John Jones and Anderson Silva do not belong in the GOAT rankings. Let's start with the two most important factors: quality of competition and dominance. They cannot exist without one another. You can be dominant, but if your opponents are of low quality, that dominance isn't nearly as impressive. On the other hand, if you are constantly fighting elite contenders, but keep losing or barely winning close decisions, that doesn't make you the greatest fighter either. You have to beat the greatest to be the greatest. The greatest fighter should rarely, if ever, show clear inferiority to an opponent. Likewise, they shouldn't spend large portions of their career being dominated or completely outclassed. Losing a close fight, even later in a career or outside of a fighter's prime, is perfectly acceptable. Aging is natural, and no one can stay at their peak forever. However, there is a difference between remaining competitive and repeatedly being completely outclassed. Every fight is part of a fighter's career and legacy. If a fighter chooses to continue competing, they also accept responsibility for the results that follow. It doesn't make sense to dismiss every loss by simply saying he was out of his prime. If that were enough, any fighter could continue losing indefinitely without it affecting their legacy. Greatness should be judged by everything that happened inside the cage, not by selectively ignoring parts of a career. This is also why I don't believe in a separate prime GOAT discussion. That conversation usually focuses on a handful of spectacular performances or how dominant a fighter looked at their peak, rather than on their overall body of work. GOAT should be determined by a fighter's complete career, overall performance, and resume, not just their highest peak. As I mentioned earlier, the only exception would be a fighter who achieves in a very short period of time what it took everyone else years to accomplish. In that case, their entire career would essentially be their peak. Now, let's move on to title defenses and length of reign. These two criteria are closely connected to the previous ones, and are nearly as important. In the case of a fighter with a normally paced career, the length of their reign shows that they were able to continuously defeat new contenders, adapt to evolving styles, constantly adjust their tactics, and maintain the mentality required to stay at the top for a long period of time. This is why it's difficult to put into words just how important title defenses are. When you are a contender, you prepare specifically for one title shot and one champion. But once you become the champion, staying there is much harder. Now, everyone is coming after you. Everyone wants to take your belt just as badly as you once wanted to win it. They study your style, train specifically to beat you, and give their absolute best every time they face you. As the champion, you must also avoid becoming complacent, which adds another mental challenge to defending the belt, which means you must constantly adapt, improve, and evolve to remain one step ahead of the rest of the division. Every successful title defense increases the amount of available footage for future challengers. The longer you stay champion, the more information your opponents have about your habits, tendencies, strengths, and weaknesses, while you constantly have to prepare for unfamiliar challengers. Another major advantage is becoming a multi-division champion. Being the best fighter in the world in one competitive weight division is already incredibly difficult, even in the weight class where your natural weight belongs. Stepping outside that comfort zone to compete against naturally bigger and heavier opponents, or constantly draining yourself through difficult weight cuts to fight in a lower division, while still remaining at the highest level, is an extraordinary achievement. A fighter who succeeds in multiple divisions proves that their success wasn't dependent on a single weight class or a specific group of opponents. It expands the range of elite opponents they have defeated while also placing them in less favorable circumstances. In the history of the UFC, there have been around 78 undisputed champions, yet only 11 have managed to become champions in multiple weight divisions. That alone shows how rare and difficult this accomplishment truly is. One very important thing to keep in mind is that none of these criteria should be viewed in isolation. Greatness is determined by how well a fighter performs across all of them, not by excelling in just one. These criteria are by far the most important indicators of a fighter's achievements and overall greatness. Before we begin the top 15 GOAT list, I'd first like to mention that I try to evaluate each fighter as fairly as possible based on the criteria discussed earlier, taking all of their achievements into account. I also think it's more accurate to look at this ranking in tiers rather than focusing too much on the exact order. Tier 5 includes fighters ranked from 13 to 15, Tier 4 includes 10 to 12, Tier 3 includes 5 to 9, Tier 2 includes 2 to 4, and Tier 1 consists of the ultimate GOAT. However, that does not mean the methodology is inconsistent. It simply means that in some specific cases, fighters achieve a very similar overall level of greatness despite excelling in different areas. One fighter may have faced stronger competition, while another may have shown greater dominance or enjoyed a longer championship reign. Since neither fighter is clearly superior across every criterion, and their overall accomplishments remain very close, reasonable people can reach slightly different conclusions while relying on the same criteria and the same evidence. Tier 5. First on the list, in Tier 5 at number 15, is Henry Cejudo. With a professional record of 16 wins and 6 losses, simultaneous two-division UFC champion in flyweight and bantamweight, defending each title once, he wasn't as dominant as some of the other fighters on the list. However, he earned major victories over Dimitri Johnson, Marlon Moraes, TJ Dillashaw, Dominic Cruz, and Sergio Pettis, which secured his place in the rankings. However, his early retirement during his peak, the relatively small number of title defenses, and his later losses, which to be fair were competitive but still losses, prevent him from being ranked any higher. At number 14, we have the one and only Ilya Abdurrahmanov. With a professional record of 17 wins and 1 loss, he achieved the status of a two-division champion, winning the undisputed featherweight title and later capturing the lightweight championship. He is already one of the sport's brightest stars, and plenty of time to achieve even more. However, we are evaluating only what he has accomplished so far. Despite having a relatively short UFC career, he arguably has the greatest 3-fight winning streak in UFC history, knocking out legends Alexander Volkanovski, Max Holloway, who had never been knocked out before, and Charles Oliveira. He also holds a dominant victory over Josh Emmett, further strengthening his resume. However, his loss to Justin Gaethje, his short championship reign, and the lack of title defenses prevent him from being ranked any higher. At number 13, we have Merab Dvalishvili. With a professional record of 21 wins and 5 losses, a 14-fight winning streak, the 4th longest in UFC history, 3 successful title defenses, and victories over Corey Sandhagen, Sean O'Malley, Umar Nurmagomedov, Henry Cejudo, Petr Yan, Jose Aldo, and Marlon Moraes, he has built an outstanding resume. His dominance rarely comes through finishes, but rather through relentless cardio, constant pressure, and elite wrestling, allowing him to control the vast majority of his opponents. Although he suffered a few losses early in his UFC career, as well as a recent loss to Petr Yan, his relatively short championship reign, and the limited number of title defenses compared to the fighters ranked above him prevent him from being placed any higher. Now, we move into Tier 4, a group of fighters whose overall achievements are relatively close, but statistically stronger than those ranked below them. At number 12, we have Max Blessed Holloway. A true legend of the sport, he holds a professional record of 27 wins and 9 losses. He is the first and one of only 2 fighters to have held an interim, undisputed, and BMF title at some point in his career, and he has consistently faced elite competition throughout his entire UFC run. He won the undisputed featherweight title and successfully defended it 3 times, while also putting together a 30-fight winning streak. His resume includes major victories over Dustin Poirier, Charles Oliveira, Justin Gaethje, Yair Rodriguez, Brian Ortega, Jose Aldo, Anthony Pettis, Colin Carter, and many others. However, in many of his biggest fights, including the rematch against Charles Oliveira, the trilogy with Alexander Volkanovski, as well as bouts against Conor McGregor and Ilia Topuria, he came up short. In some of those fights, he was decisively outclassed, despite being one of the most dominant fighters against the majority of his opponents. Because of those repeated losses against elite competition, his resume remains exceptional, but not strong enough to place him any higher on the list. At number 11, we have Kamaru Usman. With a professional record of 21 wins and 4 losses, he was the former UFC welterweight champion, successfully defending his title 5 times while putting together a 15-fight winning streak, the third longest in UFC history, during arguably the most competitive period of the welterweight division alongside GSP's era. His resume includes victories over Colby Covington, Jorge Masvidal, Gilbert Burns, Tyron Woodley, Rafael Dos Anjos, Sean Strickland, and many others, dominating a large number of those fights. However, his title loss to Leon Edwards, his inability to reclaim the championship, and his loss to Khamzat Chimaev significantly hurt his chances of being ranked any higher, even though he was never completely dominated in any of those defeats. At number 10, we have Israel Adesanya, with a professional record of 24 wins and 6 losses. During his reign as the UFC middleweight champion in one of the toughest eras of the division, he successfully defended his title 5 times. His resume includes 2 victories over Robert Whittaker, who is widely considered one of the greatest middleweights of all time, as well as wins over the previously undefeated Paulo Costa, Yoel Romero, Marvin Vettori, Jared Cannonier, and a memorable rivalry with Alex Pereira, with whom he went 1-1 in the UFC. Throughout his championship reign, he remained highly active, consistently defending his title against the division's top contenders. However, his recent losses and his unsuccessful bid to become a 2-division champion prevent him from being ranked any higher. Although moving up in weight deserves recognition, it cannot outweigh the fact that he was unsuccessful. Now we enter Tier 3, and at number 9 we have Stipe Miocic. With a professional record of 20 wins and 5 losses, he is considered the greatest heavyweight in UFC history. He holds the record for both the most overall title defenses and the most consecutive title defenses in the heavyweight division, while consistently facing elite competition. During his prime, he defeated Francis Ngannou by dominating almost the entire fight after surviving the dangerous opening minutes. He also won 2 of his 3 fights against Daniel Cormier. Throughout his championship reign, he consecutively knocked out Andrei Arlovsky, Fabrizio Verdum, Alistair Overeem, and Junior Dos Santos, building one of the strongest heavyweight resumes in UFC history. However, 4 of his 5 career losses came by knockout, and he was unable to consistently maintain control over the heavyweight division despite his remarkable achievements. At number 8, we have Jose Aldo. With a professional record of 32 wins and 10 losses, he enjoyed one of the greatest championship reigns in UFC history. His featherweight reign lasted 1,848 days, including 7 successful UFC title defenses. If we also include his WEC title defenses, his reign extends to 2,215 days, with a total of 9 successful title defenses. He remained undefeated for 10 years and successfully completed across 3 generations of fighters. His resume includes dominant victories over Jurija Faber, Cub Swanson, Kenny Florian, Chad Mendes 2 times, Frankie Edgar, and Chan Sung Jung. Later in his career, he also earned impressive wins over Jeremy Stephens, Marlon Vera, Renato Moicano, and Rob Font, proving that he remained competitive even after moving to the bantamweight division, despite never capturing the title there. However, many of his later career losses to elite opponents, such as Conor McGregor, Alexander Volkanovski, Max Holloway, Peter Yan, Marat Valashvili, were clear and convincing defeats, significantly damaging his overall resume. Nevertheless, the extraordinary longevity of his championship reign, his decade-long undefeated streak, and his dominance over multiple generations of elite fighters are enough to keep him among this place, although not enough to be ranked above the names ahead of him. At number 7, we have the Eagle, Khabib Nurmagomedov. With a perfect professional record of 29 wins and no losses, he was one of the most dominant champions in UFC history and was rarely challenged throughout his career. He successfully defended the lightweight title 3 consecutive times in arguably the most competitive division in the UFC. His resume includes victories over Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, Edson Barboza, and Rafael dos Anjos. The closest fight of his career was his bout against Gleison Tibau, which remains controversial to some. Although regardless of how it is scored, it does not significantly diminish his overall dominance. However, compared to the fighters ranked above him, his championship reign was relatively short. He accumulated fewer title defenses, and much of the first half of his professional career consisted of victories over relatively unknown opponents with limited resumes. Those factors ultimately prevent him from being ranked any higher. At number 6, we have the Lioness, Amanda Nunes. With a professional record of 23 wins and 5 losses, she enjoyed a championship reign that lasted 2,077 days. During that time, she successfully defended her title 7 times across 2 divisions, 5 in bantamweight and 2 in featherweight, while earning a total of 11 title victories. She is the only fighter in UFC history to simultaneously hold and successfully defend titles in 2 different weight classes. Her resume includes victories over every woman who held the bantamweight or featherweight title at some point before or after her, including Ronda Rousey, Misha Tate, Chris Cyborg, Valentina Shevchenko twice, and those were close fights, Holly Holm, and Germaine de Randamie twice. Her only late career loss came against Juliana Pena, whom she decisively defeated in their immediate rematch. Throughout her championship reign, she established herself as by far the greatest female fighter in UFC history. However, what prevents her from being ranked even higher is that both of the divisions she competed in were considerably less competitive than the strongest men's divisions. At the same time, it is worth acknowledging that Amanda herself played a major role in that by defeating virtually every elite contender of her era. Still, women's divisions have historically had a shallower overall talent pool and fewer elite-level fighters than the deepest men's divisions, which also affects the level of competition she faced. Combined with her few career losses, these factors keep her just outside the very top of the list. At number 5, we have Daniel Cormier. With a professional record of 22 wins and 3 losses, he became the first fighter in UFC history to successfully defend titles in 2 different weight divisions. He defended the heavyweight title once and the light heavyweight title 3 times. His only career losses came against Stipe Miocic, whom he defeated once in their trilogy, and John Jones. Despite those defeats, he was never completely outclassed and consistently remained competitive against both of them. Before suffering his first professional loss, Cormier put together a 15-fight winning streak while competing against elite opposition. His resume includes victories over Antonio Silva, Josh Barnett, Alexander Gustafsson, Dan Henderson, Volkan Oezdemir, Anthony Johnson twice, Anderson Silva, and Derek Lewis. Throughout his career, Cormier consistently dominated elite competition despite fighting in 2 of the toughest divisions in the sport. However, compared to the fighters ranked above him, His shorter championship reign and fewer title defenses prevent him from being placed any higher. There is also the incident before his fight with Anthony Johnson, where he used a towel to help make weight. While this cannot be justified, it remains a single isolated incident that likely happened in the heat of the moment, under the pressure of making weight, rather than a deliberate long-term pattern of cheating. Unlike repeatedly using performance-enhancing drugs or intentionally breaking the rules over an extended period, this was not something that required continuous planning and conscious execution throughout his career. If someone chooses to discount that victory because of it, that is a reasonable position to take. At tier 2 and number 4, we have Dimitri Johnson. With a professional record of 25 wins, 4 losses, and 1 draw, he holds the UFC record for the most consecutive title defenses with 11 and the most flyweight title wins with 12. His championship reign lasted 2,142 days, the second longest in UFC history, making him unquestionably the greatest flyweight champion of all time. Throughout his reign, he consistently dominated the elite opposition and was often several steps ahead of the rest of the division. None of his 4 career losses were one-sided or devastating, as he remained competitive in every defeat. Because of his overwhelming dominance, there was little room for other stars to emerge during his reign. Although the flyweight division was often criticized at the time, it still featured elite fighters such as Henry Cejudo, Joseph Benavidez, John Dodson, and Kyoji Horiguchi. He also competed extensively at bantamweight, where he recorded 11 victories, along with 3 of his 4 career losses. It is also worth mentioning that he fought 6 times in one championship under its flyweight division, whose weight limit is equivalent to the UFC's bantamweight division. His only defeat there came against Adriano Moraes, whom he later defeated twice. During his time in one championship, he won 2 titles and successfully defended one of them. His career was truly extraordinary, and the only significant factor preventing him from being ranked even higher is that, despite being stronger than it is often given credit for, the flyweight division was still not as deep or competitive as divisions such as lightweight or welterweight. At number 3, we have Alexander Volkanovski. With a professional record of 28 wins and 4 losses, he successfully defended the UFC featherweight title 6 times, with his first 5 defenses coming consecutively. His championship reign lasted 1,526 days. Although he never became a 2-division champion, he proved himself across multiple weight classes, compiling a record of 16 wins and 1 loss at featherweight, 8 wins and 2 losses at lightweight, and 4 wins and 1 loss at welterweight. It is also worth mentioning that during his amateur career, he went undefeated at middleweight with a record of 4 wins and 0 losses. Volkanovski arguably possessed the strongest overall resume in UFC history. A remarkable number of his most important fights, which is 7, came against fighters who also appear on this list. 3 of his 4 career losses came against just 2 of them. Islam Makhachev twice, after moving up to lightweight to challenge for a second title, and Ilya Topuria. His first fight against Islam is widely regarded as one of the closest championship fights in recent UFC history, with many believing Volkanovski had done enough to win. His resume also includes victories over Max Holloway 3 times, Diego Lopez 2 times, Yair Rodriguez, Chan Sung Jung, Brian Ortega, Jose Aldo, and Chad Mendes. Throughout most of those fights, he either clearly dominated his opponents or delivered elite-level performances against world-class competition. The only thing preventing him from being ranked as the greatest fighter in UFC history is that despite his extraordinary resume and consistency, he ultimately fell short against some of the very best fighters of his era. At number 2, we have Islam Makhachev. With a professional record of 28 wins and 1 loss, he became a champion in 2 weight divisions, holding titles in both lightweight and welterweight. He also holds the UFC lightweight record for the most successful title defenses with 4, and is tied for the longest winning streak in UFC history with 16 consecutive victories, an especially remarkable achievement considering that lightweight is widely regarded as one of the deepest and most competitive divisions in the sport. His resume includes victories over some of the greatest fighters of his era, including Alexander Volkanovski twice, Charles Oliveira, Dustin Poirier, Jack Della Maddalena, Renato Moicano, and Bobby Green. Even before becoming champion, he consistently defeated high-level opponents such as Dan Hooker, Thiago Moise, Drew Dober, Arman Tsarukyan, Chris Wade, and Davey Ramos. The only loss of his career came by knockout against Adriano Martins early in his UFC run. His first fight with Alexander Volkanovski was highly competitive, but aside from that, he has dominated virtually every elite opponent he has faced. The only factors preventing him from being the greatest fighter in UFC history are his comparatively shorter championship reign, fewer title defenses than the fighter ranked above him, and the fact that he has not yet accumulated the same volume of elite victories over time. And now, for the final tier, Tier 1, and the number 1 spot, the greatest UFC fighter of all time, Georges St. Pierre. With a professional record of 26 wins and 2 losses, he has it all. The undisputed greatest welterweight of all time, he has 9 title defenses in the welterweight division and is also a 2-division champion, having captured the middleweight title with his victory over Michael Bisping. He holds the tied record for the most consecutive title wins, 13, the most consecutive rounds won, 33 across 9 title fights, and the most controlled time in UFC history. Throughout his career, he consistently fought elite competition, earning around 20 high-level victories, including wins over 11 former or future UFC champions. His most notable victories came against BJ Penn twice, Matt Hughes twice, Nick Diaz, Carlos Condit, Jake Shields, John Fitch, Johnny Hendricks, Josh Koscheck twice, Thiago Alves, Sean Shirk, and Frank Trick. His only 2 losses against Matt Hughes and Matt Serra were both avenged in dominant fashion. Aside from those defeats, he consistently dominated his opponents, with around 20 of his victories being clear and convincing performances. His only truly controversial fight was against Johnny Hendricks. While many people point to JSP's facial damage at the end of the fight as evidence that Hendricks should have won, dominance is determined by rounds or a finish, not simply by visible damage. Since the ABC Unified Rules update in 2017, damage has been prioritized even more, but judges have always scored MMA fights round by round whenever they go the distance. In this particular fight, there was constant back and forth action between both fighters. People can reasonably disagree on how individual rounds were scored, but it is undeniable that the fight itself was highly competitive. There was also an incident during his fight with BJ Penn where JSP's corner applied Vaseline to his back and shoulders. While this should certainly be criticized, it would be unfair to place the primary responsibility on JSP himself rather than on his corner. Nevertheless, if someone chooses to discount that victory because of the unfair advantage, that is completely a reasonable position to take. Looking at all of these factors together, we can confidently conclude that Georges St. Pierre fulfills every major criterion established at the beginning of this ranking. He consistently fought elite competition, dominated it throughout his career, avenged every loss he ever suffered, became a champion in 2 divisions, enjoyed a championship reign lasting 2,064 consecutive days, remained a clean competitor, and built one of the greatest championship resumes in UFC history. For those reasons, Georges St. Pierre is the greatest UFC fighter of all time.